Hello, and welcome to Third Set of Eyes. This is our second guide video on the Ork Kommandos, this time focusing on their deployment options to help you with getting those units onto the table. My name is Mouse, let's get into the video. It's like I love to say, deployment can't win you a game, but it can definitely lose you one. When you approach the table as the Kommandos, what are the things that you're looking for? Here's my general thought process. To orient you with this game board, this is a narrow board deployment, with the deployment zones being 6 inches up the short edges of the board. The board is populated with Chalnath terrain, which means that everything is heavy and obscuring, which is good for us as the Kommandos. First, are the two sides of the board roughly equivalent? Each deployment zone looks roughly the same, but let's go through the pieces. If they aren't equal, what makes them different? There are two large cathedral ruins that dominate the center of this board. Each one is further than 3 inches from the deployment zone, meaning that you can't cheat an operative onto the vantage using the reposition scouting option. There are also two large heavy ruined walls protecting each deployment zone, and each deployment zone has a protected way to stage for the midboard. At first glance, this board looks to be pretty fair to both sides. Where are the mission objectives, and what is the mission for the game? This can be important for what operatives to bring, as well as what your game plan is to address each mission type. Some missions require you to be fast and early to objectives, while others require you to hold a point until the end of the game. Knowing the mission early on can help you formulate your strategy before dice even get rolled. In Kill Team 2024, we currently deploy our teams by dividing our operatives into thirds and alternating with our opponent. For the Kommandos, this most often means deploying 4 units up front, 4 in the middle, and then our final 3. This will be the standard split in nearly all games, so it's easy to get into the habit of thinking about which 3 units we want to hold back, protecting that information until the last moment. Let's break down a typical deployment grouping. In group number 1, I like to deploy our 2 commando boys, the Breacher Boy and the Daka Boy. Deploying these units gives my opponent something to think about, but I'm not committing any of my big pieces yet. The only trick here is that you want to think about your Breacher Boy's positioning for turns 1 and 2. He can be an important utility tool that allows the rest of your team to get into unusual spots. I like to deploy him early so that I don't forget about this and I can build the rest of my game plan around the options that he creates. In group number 2, I deploy the remainder of my non-critical operatives. This won't be the same in every game, since sometimes you want to hold back other operatives for the third group, but I typically deploy the Slasher Boy, Comms Boy, Sniper Boy, and Bomb Squig at this stage. Depending on whether we are the attacker or defender, I have some information about the opponent's game plan and can now start to counter-deploy. I often position the Slasher Boy so that I can either engage enemy melee specialists or threaten non-melee units. The Comms Boy usually gets placed so that he can hand out APL buffs while staging for turn 2, but I also want to be able to flex him between mid and close objectives since his utility around mission actions can give me some nice flexibility. The Sniper Boy gets placed either where he can begin moving towards a dug-in position, or where he can support units moving up the board if I don't think he's going to act like a Cypress Nest. Don't forget that he can be mobile and provide helpful shooting even without camping out. Finally, the Bomb Squig gets set up here again to make my opponent sweat about their remaining deployments. Oftentimes the Bomb Squig is my final activation of turn 1, so I set him up where he can threaten a suicide opener to turn 2. In our final group, we have just 3 remaining operatives. Like I said earlier, these won't always be the same, but the Grot should probably always be deployed in this group. I make sure to position this little guy somewhere where he can see multiple vantage points and objectives, just to keep my opponent guessing about where he's going. Since the Grot can be critical to our TAC-Op game plan, keeping him hidden until the last opportunity can help give us those sneaky points. The Rocket Boy represents some of the most powerful shooting on the team, but it isn't as scary as it used to be. Similar to the Sniper Boy, I place this model in the general area where I think I'm going to need the most firepower to threaten my opponent. Depending on the board and the matchup, I might swap this with the Sniper Boy. I also deploy the Knob Leader here, since he's the single most flexible unit on the squad. With 3 APL, 14 wounds, and a solid melee profile, I can use him as my anchor for a flank if I need some extra beef to hold it down. While setting up for turn 2, make sure to hand out his APL buff to a unit that is already activated to carry that buff over into the next turn. With all that in your mind, let's look at some sample pre-game setups for the Ork Kommandos. Let's say we're deploying on side 1 of this sample board layout. Again, this board will have a 6-inch deployment zone, shown here. As I talked about with our deployment groups, let's run through how we might place Group 1. I'd like to show my opponent at this stage that I'm considering all 3 objectives, so I want to have operatives set up accordingly. One of my commando boys can tuck up against the wall on the left flank here, which will enable him to move up the board and threaten Objective 1 in the second turning point. My second commando boy will stage in a similar way on the right flank to threaten Objective 3. The Breacher boy, as I mentioned before, is a useful utility piece, and I don't yet know what my opponent's game plan is going to be. As such, I'll tuck him against the central wall so that he can flex across the board and break open some of this heavy terrain. My most likely move is for him to bust a hole in the wall here to allow for my team to have better access around Objective 3. Finally, the Daka boy will cover the left flank along with that first commando boy. His high mobility will help him close the distance needed to push that far objective, and the fact that that area of the map looks open will help his modest damage output if the opponent wants to stand in the open. If pushing into that objective doesn't look good, however, I can just easily rotate the Daka boy to support the middle objective instead. Now that we've gotten our first group deployed, let's take a look at the second group. To reinforce the middle objective, I'll put the Slasher boy in the center on the other side of the wall from the Breacher boy. With this placement, I'm probably going to have to spend a lot of movement getting over the wall, but my primary goal with him is to stage for turning point 2 anyway. I just want him to be able to threaten both the middle and close objective in case my opponent decides to push early. Also placed at this time is the Comms boy. I'll pair him with the Commando boy on the right flank, and since I'm planning to just stage that boy to secure our close objective, the Comms boy will easily be able to move up behind him and pass out an APL buff that'll carry into the next turn. With a 3 APL boy on that side, I can threaten to move up, cap the objective, and retreat if my opponent's being passive. I can also move and dash to cover a large distance before throwing a crack grenade, or maybe I just want to charge and fight before reclaiming the objective. There are a lot of options just by planning to buff the boy and waiting to see what your opponent does. Still in Group 2, the Sniper boy can get set up to cover the right flank, probably trailing the Comms boy and the Commando boy on that side. Depending on his positioning after moving up, however, he has the ability to swing to the left and cover that long central corridor, or keep onto the right side. I just want to make sure that I have at least one long-range threat in position to cover those 2 objectives that I'm primarily contending for. The final operative in Group 2 is the Bomb Squig, who gets positioned so that he can move and dash behind the big heavy wall at the end of the turn and stage for that turning 2 opener. Depending on the board state at the end of the turn, I'll be doing one of 2 things with him. 1, tucking him behind the heavy terrain and trying to position him so that he won't be seen through windows or around the corner, so that he can wait until turn 3 for a charge, or 2, running him into the open at the end of turn 1 and hoping that I win the initiative roll-off for turning point 2. In scenario 2, even if I lose initiative, I have a pretty good idea of what my opponent's first move is going to be, so I can counterpunch somewhere else if I've got that set up. It might feel like a crazy gambit, but realistically, you either break even or come out ahead if your rolls are favorable. Alright, let's figure out the placement of our final 3 operatives, who hopefully are our most important pieces to this puzzle. First up is the Knob Leader, who fits right into the last space along the right flank behind the heavy cover. It's important to make sure that you are leaving the right size gaps, so feel free to measure as you go along. His placement allows for him to hand out an APL buff that'll carry over into the next turn, just like the Comms boy, while still jockeying for position into the middle of the board. Even though he is the leader of the team, don't be afraid to send him into melee if you can get an important kill first. Just make sure you're not throwing the unit away, and you have ways to further punish your opponent if they take him out for it. The Rocket Boy is going to hang out on the center line here, covering the middle objective and position to move up where it can cover the left flank as well. Don't push too far forward without having someone like a Commando Boy or Slasher Boy to frontline for him, but he can definitely shoot some firepower downrange if the opponent wants to push past their staging line of heavy cover. Finally, the star of our show, the little Commando Grot. As I talked about in the Commandos introduction video, Gather Surveillance is a great tac op for this Commandos team, and we want to set up the Grot for success. The Grot here is positioned so that he can see 2 important pieces of vantage terrain and cover objectives 1 and 2. By saving this operative until the end of the turning point, you can force your opponent to commit to their game plan and then send the Grot somewhere that he can't get touched instead. Especially if you can find a nice bit of vantage terrain, the Grot can then just camp out up there and spy on the enemy team for the rest of the game, likely scoring you 2 victory points every turn. That'll do it for our first example of deployment. If you've made it this far, please drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future guides like this one. Okay, so we've gone through one deployment, but what about the other side? Let's take a look at how some aspects change and what stays the same. Again, we've got a 6-inch deployment zone to work with, but I'll give you a couple of seconds to look at this side and generalize how you might set up a Kommandos deployment. Alright, I'm going to give you my thoughts, but you can pause the video if you'd like to think through things a little bit more before you hear my 2 cents. Starting again with the deployment group number 1, first up are the 2 commando boys. The first one will take the board edge on the left side, positioned so that they can climb over the wall and stage towards objective 3 by hugging the wall on that flank. The second boy is set up along the center line, which will allow them to flex between the objective in the middle, objective 2, and objective on the flank, objective 3. As melee threats, I want both of them to be able to threaten charges on enemy units that move into range by being on objectives in Turning Point 2. Our Breacher Boy is going to be set up in the middle of the U-shaped wall on the right flank, and he's going to be positioned so that the hole he breaks in the wall enables the rest of our team to funnel through and effectively stage for Turning Point 2. One of the shortcomings of this deployment side would be the restriction of movement around this large wall, but the Breacher Boy addresses that problem nicely. The final operative in deployment group 1 is the Daka Boy, who I would set up on the left flank so that they can follow the 2 commando boys up the board and threaten some return shooting if they come under fire. The second batch of operatives to deploy begins with the Slasher Boy. As I mentioned before, the Breacher Boy will be creating a hole in this heavy wall on the right flank, so setting up the Slasher Boy here still gives us a variety of staging options as we get ready for Turning Point 2. Moving up to stage behind the heavy wall on the right flank will cover this melee specialist nicely, and again will give us flexibility between objective 2 in the middle and the close objective, objective 1. The Comms Boy will follow behind the Commando Boy in the center, able to flex across the back line and pass out his APL buff. The Sniper Boy can be set up on the far right flank, hopefully to swing wide and shoot at any units that are trying to push into our safe objective. By covering our safe objective with the Sniper, we make it really difficult for our opponent to push up without committing a lot of resources. The last operative of the group here to deploy is the Bomb Squig, who again gets set up behind heavy cover and towards the center of the board. If necessary, the Squig can use the Breacher to funnel in behind him, or can climb over the wall and position more towards the left flank. Regardless, this will be one of the last operatives to activate in the first turn, so we can potentially create that turning 2 opening gambit that we discussed earlier. Our last 3 operatives again make up our final deployment group. The Commando Knob is set up next to the Breacher Boy to use his Breach token to get through the heavy wall and stage again for Turning Point 2. Also, he can still be handing out his APL buff while he does this, so make sure to time things appropriately. The Rocket Boy could be set up along the center line here in the back, but I've opted to put him next to the Sniper Boy on the right flank. The reason for this is that the whole board is heavy terrain, meaning that the likelihood the rocket is going to find an unobscured shot from the mid-board is pretty small. As such, I'd rather overload the right flank, which has pretty open lines of shooting, and then use the combination of Sniper Boy and Rocket Boy to prevent any pushes from my opponent. If my opponent opts for a more passive flank on that side, those 2 operatives can cover each other if I decide to push that flank myself. Finally, the all-important Grot gets set up on the left flank, where he can see points on both vantage points that are within the enemy's territory, plus can cover objectives 2 and 3 in case the mission calls for it. This terrain is especially difficult to bother climbing, so since there's no cover when you get up top, my opponent is unlikely to be sending units up there in the first place, so if I can hold off on activating the Grot, I won't give away my game plan until it's too late for them to respond. And that'll wrap up our second deployment example of the Ork Kommandos. Just as a reminder, these are example deployments, and plenty of things can change about these to better address your personal circumstances. Make sure to experiment with a variety of map layouts, missions, and enemy teams. Part of the fun of Kill Team is not knowing everything about a particular scenario when you walk into it. Don't forget about the new equipment options as well. I pretty much always take 2 crack grenades and the Kommandos dynamite equipment, but that still gives you at least 2 equipment options like barricades and ladders if you want to protect certain parts of the board or add increased verticality for your team. Not all boards are going to be set up perfectly, so sometimes you'll need to bring your own cover with you. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for your viewing support. A small channel like ours really benefits from your engagement, so leave a comment saying which of the two deployments you'd prefer if you have a preference. I'd also love to see what the community thinks about this board layout. That's going to conclude our general guidance for the Ork Kommandos, so until we see you again, have fun and be good if you want to.